Today we're going to talk about South Africa and the Mfecane and the Great Trek. And the word Mfecane, which is on your screen, is an important word in African history. And even though it looks difficult, you should memorize it. And it's pronounced Mfecane. And we're also going to talk about the Great Trek at the same time. Now on the opening slide here, what you're really looking at are two images, because this is not what we're going to talk about today, but this is where we're going to go in terms of understanding South African history and indeed Southern African history. On the left side of the screen, you see a picture of a lot of workers, because the importance of that is that the economy of South Africa is based extensively on the migration of workers from throughout Southern Africa, not just South Africa itself, to work in the gold mines, the diamond mines, on agriculture, and that when we get into the second part of the course and we talk about South Africa in the 20th and 21st century, the migration of workers is a major phenomenon, and I wanted you to get an idea if that's where we're going. The picture on the right is a modern view of Johannesburg, because obviously you get the sense that South Africa is an extremely modern country, well-developed country, and that image gives you that sense. Now we want to go back to the 18th and the 19th centuries and see the background and how South Africa got to where it is in the present. And here's a rough chronology of the major events that I want to talk about today. And remember that you can view these PowerPoints again, so that this chronology is therefore before you at any time you want. And in some ways, I really want to start with 1652, which is the time when the Dutch East India Company founded the Cape Colony at Table Bay. That is the modern city of Cape Town. And 1652 until 1795, the colony at the southern tip of South Africa was a Dutch colony, and it was related much more to the passage of ships to the Dutch East Indies, which is now, of course, Indonesia, and to other parts of the Indian Ocean, indeed the Pacific Ocean. And the port at Cape Town was extremely important in the passage of ships in both directions, and indeed it still is. In 1795, the British seized the Cape Colony from the Dutch, and although they returned the colony to Dutch rule for a couple of years during the Napoleonic Wars, the British reoccupied Cape Colony in 1806, and from there on it was a British colony and was in effect the basis of modern South Africa. The division between British control on the one hand and the fact that many of the European settlers at South Africa were Dutch was a conflict, a friction that lasted right down to the present. The Dutch in South Africa eventually are being called Boers, and then after that they're called Afrikaner, and an Afrikaner is the term that is used today. But they are descendants of the Dutch, and the Afrikaner language is in fact a dialect of the Dutch language. Between 1816 and 1826, the most important event in the interior of South Africa was the creation, the foundation of the Zulu state under Shaka, which we will be talking about a little more, and you will be seeing a video that goes into much more detail on the foundation of the Zulu state and the implications for the foundation of the Zulu state. And the next major chronological event was really what is referred to as the Great Trek. The trek meaning the same thing it means in English. If you trek, you walk, you take a journey, you travel. And the Great Trek was when the Boers, that is the descendants of the Dutch settlers, now called Afrikaner, left the Cape Colony in order to escape British rule. And they left at a time right after 1834 and the emancipation of slaves in British colonies. And one of the reasons that the Boers left was because they took their slaves with them rather than emancipate them. And they left British territory in order to maintain slavery, and that was a crucial development in the history of South Africa. And in doing so, the Boers founded two what became independent states. One was the Orange Free State, the other was the Transvaal. Transvaal was in effect founded in 1852, and moreover Natal separated from the Cape Colony in 1856. And these were efforts by the Boers, the Afrikaner, to establish their own independent countries in the interior of South Africa, and ultimately, we will see this later, it led to the Boer War in the very last years of the 19th century, which was a war that pitted the Boers against the British. The Boers lost, and South Africa, modern South Africa, was created at that time, a phenomenon that we will examine in the second term. The other important details, and these relate to the picture in the opening slide of all the workers, is that diamonds were discovered at Kimberley in 1867, which led to a massive migration of Europeans in search of instant wealth in the diamond mines. And that led to the first need for local labor, labor that was employed under very oppressive conditions, low wages. And the diamond discovery of 1867 was followed by, in the mid-1880s, the discovery of gold in the Transvaal. And it was really the discovery of gold, which is the basis of South Africa's economy to this day, that led to the massive wealth and immigration of more Europeans, and ultimately to the establishment of the apartheid regime in South Africa, and the use of more and more and more labor. So that's anticipating where we're going. Now let's go back and get some pictures of actually what things look like. Cape Town is located under Table Mountain at the extreme southern tip of South Africa. Its importance is because it's a beautiful, natural, very large port, and hence an excellent place for ships to stop going to or from the Indian Ocean, passing from the Atlantic, where they could get water, where they could refuel, where they could, in terms of firewood, where they could get provisions, and so on. And the Dutch settlers who moved there, in effect, made their living off of provisioning the transport trade between the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. And in the course of doing so, they also imported a lot of people who had been enslaved, some of them in East Africa, very few, but some in West Africa, and indeed quite a few who came from Asia, so that we see slaves of Asian background, we see slaves of African background, ultimately who mix together and ultimately form the population that's known in South Africa as the colored population. And including among that enslaved population were even Muslims, so that from the very beginning there were Muslims who came from Southeast Asia, not from other parts of Africa, who were in Cape Town. This is another view from the top of Table Mountain so that you get a real sense of how high that mountain is overlooking Cape Town. And what a distinguishing feature it is if you're approaching the tip of South Africa by sea. These are three pictures of the Dutch period and early British period. Being Dutch, of course, you won't be surprised to see windmills like the one here that is pictured that still stands. It was a mill that was a windmill that was established in 1796 and still stands. You see what the main street of Cape Town looked like at the time from a drawing, and you can see the area that was the map there that really shows the area that was the Cape Colony. And it really is only the western part of the very southern tip of South Africa. This is the Castle of Good Hope that the Dutch built, a gigantic fort. It was constructed between 1666 and 1679 and is still there, although today it's a museum, of course. And this, the company that operated the Dutch trade, the Dutch East India Company, maintained this fort, and the company was the largest slave owner in South Africa because they needed, they used the enslaved population to not only initially to build the fort, but also to maintain it, to staff it, and to do all the work that went on inside. Now, the second major development, besides the population of the Cape Colony, which you see on the southern part of this map, was a development that is traced to the first decades, the first 2 decades of the 19th century. And this is, you will see in much greater detail in the video that we're showing today on Shaka and the Zulu. But what you see here is that beginning after 1815 was the development of extensive warfare in area that was beyond British rule and British control, and in many ways had nothing to do with the British, but it led to the foundation of a new state, the Zulu, and it led to the establishment of, in effect, a new ethnic group, the Zulu. We're now the largest ethnic group in South Africa, and it is one example in African history where the ethnic group can be, when it came into existence and why it came into existence, can be very precisely dated. And in this case, it was related to the rise and consolidation of a state that was built on the basis of a military dictatorship and based on the permanent war footing of the male population. And it was responsible for what is known among historians, it was known in the local language as the Mfakani, which means roughly translated into English as the crushing. Because what as you will see in the film on Zulu, what the soldiers were able to do was to develop, under Shaka, and Shaka is credited with the development of this military technology, of forming very disciplined regiments of troops who used nothing more than short stabbing spears and a cutting blade and a very big rawhide shield. And then how they faced their enemy is that they lined up together and they marched forward and they did not stop, and they just slaughtered people in their way. And so it was a very, very disciplined army of young men. Shaka is responsible for its the development of this military technique. But what happened in terms of the Mfakani is Shaka had an absolute rule that if anybody turned and ran on the battlefield, they would be executed. And any one of his generals who lost a battle would be executed. And as a result, nobody lost a battle, and in the few cases where people did lose a battle, the troops didn't come home. They just left. And as a result, the phenomenon of the Memphikani spread, as you see from this map, all the way to Tanzania in the north, to Zambia, to Botswana, to Mozambique, and everywhere else in South Africa. And the short-term impact of all that was to completely depopulate a very large part of South Africa, the region that became known as Transvaal. Transvaal means across the Vaal River. The Transvaal area, which had been heavily populated, suddenly became completely depopulated, and this made it possible for the Afrikaner, the Boers, to move into the area and steal the land. This is a photo of what a Zulu soldier looked like, with his short stabbing spears that to some extent look like the ones that are right behind me here on the wall that you can see, which are here in the Tubman Institute collection. And you can see the very large rawhide shield, which was used to protect the soldier from who were all marching in formation, which you will see in the video. But it protected from arrows and from other knives. And then the idea was that the soldiers never broke rank, and they just mowed down the opposition. So here are the various factions and states that were created as a result of the Memphikani, a summary so that you can get some sense of what happened. Linguistically, all of these groups belong to the section of the Bantu-speaking population. The Bantu-speaking population of very closely related languages in southern Africa are all referred to as Nguni. But there are different sections of them that are known and are sometimes referred to as tribes or ethnic groups or so on. But remember, these languages are all quite closely connected. First is the Zulu, who was under Shaka as the leader, and then his successors, including Dingani, we'll talk about in a minute. The Matabele, who are under Mzilikazi, and who established the state of the Ndebele. Ngwani, another ethnic group or Nguni faction, who was under Sobuza, which established the Swazi state and Swaziland. Swazi exists today. The Ngoni, who are also a subsection of the Nguni, who are under Zwangendaba, and they moved out of the region, and they moved as far north as Lake Malawi and Lake Tanganyika. The Xhosa refugees, in particular, were known as the Mfengu. They moved into the Eastern Cape region, quite close to the Cape Colony, and hence the ones who were most in immediate conflict with the Cape Colony when the Cape Colony started to expand into the interior. The Sotho, who are under Mosheshwe, established the state that is now the modern country of Lesotho. And finally, the Kololo under Sepetwane, who conquered the Swana and who are now in effect formed a state that became Botswana. So those are the different factions of the Memphikani and the warfare that spread throughout all of the southern third of the continent, and was in many ways comparable in terms of chronology to the expansion of Egypt into southern Sudan that we talked about last week, and in some ways similar to the expansion of Tipu Tip, who expanded in from Zanzibar in East Africa. In all three cases, you see in the 19th century a major movement on a military basis into different parts of Africa, and one of the consequences in all of the areas, including the Memphikani, was the enslavement of people who were conquered. Now, the Great Trek happened in the context of the Memphikani, in the sense that the Memphikani depopulated large areas And just at the time that the Dutch settlers, the Boers, decided to abandon the British colony and move into the interior. And here you see a picture of the covered wagons and oxen and how they moved into the interior and took over the land and created the independent countries of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, and the establishment of control over Natal. Natal is where the modern city of Durban is located. Here is a map that shows basically the migration of the Boers. They didn't stop there. They went as far as Angola. They went further north. They went anywhere they could with their covered wagons and their guns, and took up land and herded cattle, and whenever necessary enslaved anybody they could, because they were not against slavery. One of the crucial here another picture showing the types of routes where the Boers took. One of the crucial events was what is known as the Battle of Blood River that took place in 1838 in what's now Natal, in which 470 Boers, you see them in the picture here, circled their wagons into a formation, and with their guns withstood an attack by an estimated 10,000 Zulu warriors. And you can well imagine that the Zulu tactics with their shields and their stabbing swords didn't work very well when they had to go up against guns. And consequently, it was a big massacre of the Zulu, which is why the river turned the color of blood. And it was actually on the banks of the Nkome River. And it resulted in the formation of ultimately a settlement between the Boers and the Zulu, who came to terms and came to peace and established a boundary that results in, which is very important in terms of understanding contemporary politics in South Africa. It led to the creation of Kwazulu and Natal. So this is a political map that shows the Orange Free State, Natal, and Transvaal, and it shows how the Cape Colony expanded further into the interior, primarily to try to keep the Boers under control, which they were not able to do. And it shows Basotho land, that is Lesotho, where the Sotho people live, which was very mountainous, and therefore was defendable both against the Boers, who didn't want to live there because it wasn't good agricultural land, and against the Zulu, who couldn't penetrate it. But this is a map from about 1860, before the discovery of diamonds and before the discovery of gold, which would change everything, and which we'll talk about in the second term. So here's South Africa in 1910, which is after the Boer War. The Boers have been defeated. The British colony has been established, and these are the modern boundaries of South Africa. You see Swaziland, Swazi, one of the Mfakani groups, Basotho, one of the other Mfakani groups, establishing separate states, which also come under British rule. You see the German Southwest Africa, what is then called Bechuana land, which is now Botswana, which came under British rule. Mozambique on the far right, which was Portuguese, but the colony of South Africa at this point in 1910. So, who have I left out of the picture? I haven't talked very much about the Xhosa. This is a picture of Xhosa women. Xhosa is an interesting language because it is a Bantu language, but is borrowed very, very heavily from Khoikhoi. And Khoikhoi was not a Bantu language. Khoikhoi was the language of people that were already settled in South Africa before the Bantu migration into this region 1,000 years ago. And the survivors of that were Khoikhoi, who were cattle herders and who ultimately were completely dispossessed of their lands, their cattle, and became subservient to the British and were incorporated into the population that today is known as colored, which was a mixture of the Khoikhoi and a mixture of the enslaved populations that had been brought from other parts of Africa and from Asia. The Xhosa, by contrast, were Bantu, and they were refugees from the Zulu wars, and they moved further south in order to escape the Zulu. And the click in their language, Xhosa, is one of the characteristic of the Khoikhoi language, which is a language that has clicks in it. And there are actually 3 clicks in Xhosa. There's a no, and there's a, and there's a. So there are 3. They're not very difficult. And people who don't know these languages and don't know the clicks sometimes think, well, this is really difficult to know these. But I can tell you from personal experience that I have known people who, when I was a graduate student, who were Xhosa, and their babies, when they first start to learn to speak, just like any other, they copy their parents, and so therefore some of the first sounds you hear a Xhosa baby saying is mm. So it's not difficult at all, and you learn those clicks. The Khoikhoi actually have more different varieties of clicks, and all of the southern Bantu languages have 1 or more clicks. Xhosa just has 1 that's in the name of its ethnic group itself. So now we get to look at the videos, the 2 videos, I believe, that are one relating specifically to Shaka Zulu, and the other one, which is on, I can't remember. you can cut this. Well, both are on the Mfecane and the Zulu. I hope